The reduction of racism and prejudice through cultural competence training. HaydenRichards, student number 31467067. Objectives. The main argument is that cultural competency greatly reduces implicit racism and prejudice. Intergroup contact theory provides a basis for cultural competency training to draw from, with abundant empirical support of its effect on reducing prejudice. Rodenberg and Boyson, 2013. Studies show cultural competency and sensitivity training effectively leads to cultural competence, with cultural knowledge and skill of health providers both improving greatly after training. Beach et al. 2005. Studies support that cultural competency leads to greater patient satisfaction. Beach et al. 2005, which can be linked to studies into aversive racism. Rodenberg and Boyson, 2013, implying reduction in implicit racism of health providers. Evidence Source 1. Aversive racism and intergroup contact theories, cultural competence in a segregated world. Rodenberg and Boyson, 2013. The aversive racism theory provides a basis for a common modern form of racism where racist tendencies are less explicit. This is formed through the natural tendency to categorize things, leading to in-groups and out-groups. Implicit racism can mean people may be unaware of their own racist tendencies. Implicit racism is often subtle and indirect. High levels of implicit racism with low levels of explicit racism often leads to reports of feelings that the conversation is unfriendly, as small social cues from implicit racism are able to be perceived. Intergroup contact theory provides a framework for cultural competency training. Studies repeatedly suggest intergroup contact theory leads to reduced prejudice long term. Additionally, it results in generalization as studies show that the positive exposure to one outgroup can lead to less prejudice against other outgroups. This provides basis to what cultural sensitivity training is trying to address through the aversive racism model, and the source supports the idea that cultural competency can lead to reduced prejudice through the ideas from intergroup contact theory. Evidence Source 2. Cultural Competence, a Systematic Review of Healthcare Provider Educational Interventions. Beach et al. 2005. A review of 34 studies evaluating interventions for cultural competence. Cultural competence training resulted in greater cultural knowledge, with 17 out of the 19 studies that tested for cultural knowledge showing significant increase. Improved skills of health providers. 14 out of 14 studies that tested for skill levels showed beneficial effects, with such skills as improved communication abilities with minority groups, improving greater patient satisfaction. 3 out of 3 of the studies that measured for satisfaction found positive results. Implies connection to aversive racism theory, Rodenberg and Boyson, 2013, with patients reporting greater feelings of friendliness and belief that the healthcare providers genuinely cared, suggesting a reduction in the implicit racism of the providers. This research supports the effectiveness of cultural competence training, with better understanding of culture from the training, and more interest in different cultures, with studies showing increased research into cultures by the healthcare providers after the training. Satisfaction also points to reduced implicit racism, supporting the contention of the essay. Evidence Source 3. Stereotype Change and Prejudice Reduction Cross-Cultural Awareness Program, Hill and Augustinos, 2001. Studied modern racism and old-fashioned racism about the Aboriginal community. Short-term effects of the cultural awareness program were statistically significant, with significant increase in cultural knowledge, significant decrease in negative stereotypes, a significant increase in positive stereotypes, general increase in positive attitudes towards the Aboriginal community. Modern racism about Aboriginal communities was reduced, and old-fashioned racism was even more significantly reduced. Long-term effects when retested 3 months later, there was a drop in knowledge from directly after the program to the 3 months later. However, it still remained higher than it was before the program. Significant decrease in old-fashioned racism in high prejudice individuals continued after the 3 months. However, stereotyping returned to almost original levels from before the program after the 3 months, and modern racism was reported to have no significant change from before the program to after the 3 months. This source supports the effectiveness of cultural training in increasing knowledge of the individuals. The stereotyping was positively altered in the short term, and there was some hope through that short-term effect. Shows some progress in reducing the old-fashioned racist views through cultural training. Evaluation of evidence. Strengths of evidence. All sources are peer-reviewed, showing greater reliability. Source 2 shows an explicit support of cultural sensitivity training and provides evidence of decreased prejudice. Source 3 shows effectiveness in increasing knowledge and provides some change in racist views, but only of the more explicit old-fashioned variety. Source 1 indicates the effectiveness of intergroup contact theory and how it can be paired with cultural sensitivity training to greatly reduce racism and prejudice. Both sources 1 and 2 are based off evidence provided by multiple studies. However, all sources note limits of cultural sensitivity training. Source 2 notes no objective assessment of attitudes, limits all the study's effectiveness in measuring prejudice reduction. Source 3 shows no significant long-term effect on prejudice in a more modern sense. Source 1 does not study cultural sensitivity training directly, as it is more focused on the studies that form the basis of cultural competence training. Conclusion. Sources support that cultural sensitivity training can be very effective. Prejudice can be somewhat reduced through training, Hill and Agostinos 2001. Improved patient satisfaction, Beach et al. 2003, linked with the aversive racism study, Ronberg and Boyson 2013, shows a reduction in implicit racism. Continued training may be needed, Hill and Agostinos 2001, as it seems that the long-term effects may not always be significant and must be more tied to the contact, Ronberg and Boyson 2013. However, more studies of cultural sensitivity training effectiveness are needed, as the framework is not as clearly defined as it needs to be. These are the references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.